Greetings. Verse 66 of the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra. Kuhanena prayogena sadya eva mṛgekṣaṇe samudeti mahānando yena tattvaṃ prakāśate. O doe-eyed woman, through the application of a trick, great joy suddenly arises, through which reality is revealed. So this is another example of a mysterious verse that can't really be understood without some commentary and without reference to the Sanskrit commentary of Shivopadhyaya. So let's break it down. First of all, there's a vocative phrase in this verse, meaning a direct address phrase, O doe-eyed woman. And that, of course, is Bhairava speaking to his consort Bhairavi. And, of course, to have doe eyes is to have big, beautiful, lovely, compassionate eyes. So it's a compliment. And it reminds us, as the author occasionally does, that this is a dialogue, this is a conversation. And indeed, it becomes a dialogue again, a back and forth towards the end of the text. And here, of course, we're in the middle of the techniques or yuktis that are taught by Bhairava. And in my numbering, which is different from other people's, this is yukti number 38. And we're about 40% of the way through the text now, by the way. Okay, so then it says, kuhanena-prayoga, through the application of a trick. What sort of trick? Well, for that we need to look to the commentary. And Shivopadhyaya gives a gloss, gives an explanation of this phrase, kuhana-prayoga, the trick method, the method of a trick, by saying here we're talking about a magic trick. We're talking about juggling. We're talking about anything that produces astonishment and wonder. So I'll give you his specific list. As I already mentioned, a magic trick is the first example. Juggling, a magical garden, right? Walking through or sitting in a magical garden is another example of this trick method. And you'll understand why in a minute. Walking by oneself amongst the trees and flowers is another example. Then we get a very funny one, apparently severing a limb and reuniting it. And this is again in the Sanskrit commentary that's hundreds of years old. So I think what he's referring to is that magic trick, well, not magic, but it works on little kids, right? Where you've got your thumb and you go, whoa, doesn't look so good on the video, doesn't work so well, but they think that's your thumb and you go, whoa, like that. That definitely seems to be what he means in the commentary, because again, he says, apparently severing a limb of the body and then reuniting it. Well, that's the only example I know of that. And again, anything that produces astonishment and wonder is the method of the trick. Okay, so what happens through this method of a trick? Kuhana-prayoga. Great joy arises, mahānando. Let me just type these phrases in the chat window. Kuhana-prayoga, method of a trick, gives rise to great joy called mahānando. And, in Abhinavagupta's enumeration, I believe this is one of the 7 levels of bliss, of ananda, But here, it's not that. This is way before Abhinavagupta, this text. I think it's just great joy in a general sense, right? So as indeed you have experienced, I hope, right, that through a magic trick or a magical, beautiful garden, or walking amongst the trees and flowers, or seeing amazing juggling, right? You do experience this joy, right? And if you don't, you're probably working too hard in your life or doing too much, because that arises naturally when we're in more of a relaxed state, right? And then he says something interesting, the original author, I mean, in the verse, yena tattvaṃ prakāśate. Through this, reality is revealed, okay? So how does that work? Well, the commentator adds in the phrase, Shivopadhyaya, the commentator, adds in the phrase nirvikalpavastha, which means the state of being temporarily free from thought. So that is an important clue, that whatever the magic trick or the magical garden or whatever, it has to be kind of amazing enough that the mind stops for a moment. The mind stops and joy arises, both simultaneously. Then you are gaining an experiential insight into the fundamental nature of reality, right? Because in our fundamental nature, we can experience this natural joy without any kind of story to cause it, without, you know what I mean? Sometimes we tell ourselves stories that make ourselves feel good. And this is something much deeper. This is a joy that arises when you're temporarily free of thought, you know, and free of your story. You don't know how the magician did that trick. And that's part of the joy. If you know, then it can be interesting to know, but there's also less joy, and it doesn't stop the mind in the same way, right? So the commentator says again, anything that produces wonder and astonishment, adbhuta, wonder, astonishment. Let's see, what else does he say here? Yeah, I think that's it. Great. So it's relatively simple, this yukti, but this is one of those relatively rare yuktis in the text where you can't do the practice independent of the right setting or context, right? So most of the practices, you know, you can do anywhere, anytime. They don't require anything outside yourself. But this one does, right? It requires that you actually, you know, go out into the world, see a magic show or juggling, or walk through a beautiful place. And by the way, interestingly, he does specifically say, for that example, he says, walking by oneself amongst the trees and flowers. So that somehow he's seeing walking as part of that, giving rise to that experience of wonder and joy and thought freeness, temporary thought freeness. Anyway, we could of course add more examples. There's no reason to say that the commentator is the final word, right? As I've mentioned in other videos, the commentator wrote like 900 years after the Vijñāna-bhairava was composed, 800 or 900 years, and so we shouldn't take him as the final word, right? But he is important, this commentator, because at the time he was alive, the tradition was still very much living and in the Kashmir Valley, not flourishing because of Muslim rule, but living, you know. So anyway, what should we add? What other examples of the method of the trick do you think we should add? Right? You can put some examples in the comments if you want. So just to come up with a good example, you need to contemplate a time when something simultaneously stopped your mind and gave rise to great joy. And then it could fit into this definition of kuhana-prayoga, the method of the trick, right? And kuhana can just mean trick in general, or magic trick in particular. It can also mean hypocritical trick, but and I did have that in an earlier translation, but after looking at the commentary, it's clear that this is not the intended meaning here. Okay, so that one is short and sweet, and there'll be more VBT videos coming. The schedule has gotten a bit erratic, but we have been doing this free course on the Facebook group and on YouTube for a year now, and it will continue for the foreseeable future anyway. It'd be wonderful to make it through the whole text. So thank you all, and thank you especially to the patrons on Patreon who support me every month. Patreon is a monthly donation site where you get content in exchange for your donation, sort of like a PBS pledge drive. But also the support on Patreon allows me to do free courses. And I've also filmed another free course, which is sort of more professionally filmed than these informal Facebook videos. So due to the patrons, these free courses are possible. I'm sorry, I was just referring to an upcoming free course, not back to the Blossoming of Innate Awareness one, which is another one. Yeah. Anyway, wonderful to share these teachings with all of you, and see you next time. Om.